Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this timely session on trade titled The Rise of Both Free Trade and Tariffs. We congregate today at a moment when the global trade landscape is being redefined. On the one hand, we are witnessing a resurgence of tariffs, industrial policy, and economic nationalism, with major powers turning inwards under banners like America First. On the other, we see regions such as the GCC doubling down on openness, continuing to build bridges between East and West through trade, logistics, and investments. This paradox of protectionism rising even as new free trade corridors open up is creating both new vulnerabilities and new opportunities. The GCC, with its sovereign strength, strategic geography, and long tradition in commerce, finds itself in a pivotal position, not merely reacting to these tariffs and to these shifts, but helping to reshape global trade flows in the process. The central question today is, how can openness remain a strategic advantage in a world increasingly redefined by friction? Will this region's connector role between continents become even more valuable, or will the fragmentation of globalization make that bridge harder to sustain? And as global supply chains are redrawn, what will it cost and who will ultimately pay to keep trade flowing efficiently, sustainably, and securely? To explore these issues, we're joined by three exceptional voices: His Excellency Abdulla Fakhro, Minister of Industry and Commerce for the Kingdom of Bahrain; Lord Gerry Grimstone, former UK Minister for Investment at the Department of International Trade, with deep expertise in navigating trade policy and investments from a European perspective; and last but not least, Ms. Henadi Al-Saleh, the Chair of the Board of Agility Group, a leading investor and operator in the logistics and transport sector, among other sectors as well. So together they bring public, private, and global insight into one of the most consequential economic debates of our time. So with that, let's begin. And Minister Abdullah, if I might start with you, let me ask you about the GCC's long-held position of openness and positioning itself as an open, rules-based trading region, even as the world drifts towards protectionism. Do you think this openness will remain a source of competitive advantage rather than a vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Naser. It's a pleasure to have you in Bahrain, and it's a pleasure to have everybody here and welcome them in Bahrain. To answer your question, Naser, I wouldn't say that I would define this as a global trend towards protectionism. I think what's happening globally is, starting with the US, which you mentioned, the tariffs which were imposed. The US administration was very clear on the reasons for those tariffs, and those were a historic negative balance of trade with globally. So the US had a deficit of around $1 trillion annually, which is a huge number. And you know, the administration was clear that the globalization has worked for many countries. The US are feeling like globalization hasn't worked as much as they would have liked. So as a result, the tariffs are, the US has decided to impose these tariffs. I don't see it as a global trend. If anything, for the GCC, I think we are doubling down on free trade and openness, and this is part of our DNA, I believe. You know, since the beginning of even dating back in Bahrain's case to the Silk Road. We've always been economies which were open, free trade, and especially considering the majority of the GCC countries are small in size. As a result, they have smaller size populations, and naturally, industry and manufacturing requires scale. So accessing global markets, tariff-free is really at the heart of our industrial policies in the GCC, and I think we're very much aligned on that. And as a result, we're in negotiations with many different countries and trading blocs on free trade agreements, one of which was mentioned earlier with the UK, which is near completion, but over 10 other countries and trading blocs are in varying stages of negotiation. So absolutely, I believe we are, if anything, more convinced that our trade policy in the GCC is the correct one, and if anything, we are doubling down on that policy.
Ms. Henadi, the GCC in many ways provides a bridge between East and West through logistics, through geography, and even through diplomacy. I've heard you once before in a panel describe what you called connector countries. So what defines a true connector country, and how can our region leverage that identity in a reshaped global trade order?
Thank you, and first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think the GCC itself is a super connector because it's always leveraged three critical aspects. The first is smart policy, the second is strong infrastructure, and the third is a digital backbone. So when I talk about smart policy, His Excellency Sheikh Salman talked about a legacy of openness. And you see that permeating all throughout and resonating with the rest of the world. You have very clear regulations, allowance for mobility, capital allocation. So that is definitely an environment in which you can build a superconnector country and a hub. Second of all, you look about the historical and for the future, the investments that are taking place in the infrastructure. You have Saudi Arabia committing to invest close to $270 billion in logistics, 59 logistics zones. You have the UAE ranking number 10 in terms of being a cargo and container hub, the same with Qatar, and so on. Those are all the elements that are required. Over and above that, if you think of where we are today with requirements with regards to the digital infrastructure and connectivity and visibility, this region is acting as a beacon in this area. It has capital, it has land, it has energy, and most of all, one of the most important things is the talent. If you think about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, today they rank in the top 20 of AI talent, and none of this in terms of connectivity and in terms of logistics can happen without the people and the talent that they permeate.
Lord Grimstone, the GCC's value proposition to foreign investors has traditionally rested on stability, openness, and infrastructure. In a world of tariffs and reshoring incentives, what new sweeteners or differentiators can the region offer to global investors?
Well, thank you, and good morning, Your Excellencies. Good morning, everybody. Let's just remember the history just for a moment. When I was a young banker, the GCC was an exporter of what you might call lazy capital. They invested in treasuries, they invested in index funds, they bought the occasional trophy asset overseas. Now, as we've heard earlier, the GCC is a huge importer of capital, a huge importer of capability and creativity. And this, I think this has become really one of the most dynamic investment regions in the world. But be in no doubt, you need to be globally competitive to win in this. This is an Olympic Games in terms of attracting foreign direct investment nowadays. And let's just sort of talk about what factors make winners out of that. Now, of course, the access to the to the sovereign wealth funds is very important. These funds are incredibly sophisticated investors, and they create partnership opportunities which are of tremendous value to companies wanting to enter the Gulf, as we heard earlier from His Royal Highness. But these partnerships in the Gulf are not just with the public bodies. I would really emphasize the opportunities for family offices in this part of the world. Family offices from overseas partnering with some of the large families and the large family offices in the Gulf to bring in capital through to that route. Look, but in the end, I don't think it's just about shiny infrastructure. I don't even think it's about low tariffs. What do investors really want? And I think there's a lesson here for all the policymakers present with us today. They want de-risked assets to new markets and inputs. They want to come somewhere where it is easier, cheaper, and faster to scale than in other countries. My whole experience tells me that's the winning formula, which of course is why a small country such as Bahrain, even though it's small, it has this huge benefit of a connected government, people willing to help, etc., etc. So never ignore those soft factors. Make it easier for companies to grow, and that is the best sweetener that you can possibly offer them.
Minister Abdullah, a little while ago you were describing the new realities of the global trade landscape. How is Bahrain navigating global trade in an era of rising protectionism and the disruptions to supply chains?
So very similar to the GCC, actually very much aligned with the GCC trade policy. Bahrain's policy has always been, as I said, dating back millennia, Bahrain has always been open to doing business, open to trade, and has been a trading hub. And trade really feeds into a lot of sectors, including the industrial sector, which is really critical to our national strategy. And today the industrial sector is the second biggest contributor to our GDP after financial services. And so without a open and free trade policy, industrial sector, logistics sector, even financial services would not be as successful, and we would not, be able to be one of the one of the world's highest countries when it comes to FDI stock relative to GDP. So this has always been a part of our ethos, and we continue to believe strongly in open and free trade. Open and free trade doesn't mean that you cannot invest in strategic local sectors in the Bahraini economy. So what we're doing and looking at very carefully is investing in manufacturing, and in specifically sectors where we feel we need to have more controls. So, and we've seen examples of the importance of having control of strategic sectors like food security, medicine security, and others during the COVID pandemic. So those, both can work in parallel. And today, what we are doing as a government is putting together a list of 12 sectors which we feel are important to reshore in Bahrain and to localize these supply chains. And we are tying up with the value of which is almost $2 billion US. And we are partnering with about 3,000 potential off-takers in Bahrain, and to set up businesses in these sectors, actual industrial manufacturing companies, in partnership with the private sector and with investment from our sovereign wealth fund, to show that we are big believers in these sectors, which we plan to to build factories in, and and really building on our strong belief that public-private partnerships are key to a successful economy.
Ms. Henadi, from your vantage point in logistics and shipping, are you seeing new corridors or hubs emerge, perhaps linking the Gulf region more directly with Asia, Africa, or South America? That play on the South-South, is it a beneficiary from this trade reconfiguration?
I'd say definitely. I mean, the Gulf has always positioned itself as a multi-directional platform. So if I think about it, we've benefited from the Gulf sort of trade diplomacy just generally. If you think about with all regions, the $2 trillion of investments announced with the US, from the Gulf being the second largest trade partner to Europe. On the back of that, you have the Gulf benefiting from foreign direct investments from China and growing trade with the ASEAN, several-fold. So it's always been multi-directional. But over and above that, what you see more recently is various trade corridors. More recently, you see, the start and the restart of the dialogue with regards to the corridor with India, Middle East, and Europe, trying to drive faster efficiency, faster visibility, going forward. You have the Saudi land bridge taking place also. So that is another impetus in terms of the Gulf again becoming a multi-directional hub, benefiting not simply from the West, but also from the East. And then I look at our experience as Agility. We've invested historically in industrial real estate, and we see just earlier this year when I was in Singapore visiting, going on a roadshow, a lot of large companies coming and approaching us looking for industrial real estate, looking for a manufacturing platform in order to start setting up in the region and using it as a base, not simply to touch the consumer market over here, but also the export market to the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So absolutely.
Lord Grimstone, as the GCC and other economies around the world push for diversification, hard, from logistics and manufacturing, like Ms. Henadi was just mentioning, to digital and green industries. How costly is this global reconfiguration likely to be? And ultimately, who's going to pay the price? Is it the consumers, the governments, the private investors?
Well, of course, at the end of the day, we all pay for it, and we all have to pay for it. But for GCC countries, diversification, of course, is not an option. It has to be done. They're faced with finite resources. They're faced with the climate change and the policies that go with that. Although I was very interested at FII last week when Richard Attias presented the results of a global survey that they had just done, that climate change has slipped down to rank only 7th amongst the preoccupation of citizens around the world. But so you have to diversify, and I really congratulate Her Excellency Noor and her team for the way that the Bahraini economy has diversified. When I was the UK's investment minister, responsible for all investment coming into the UK and all our relationships with global investors, I spent a lot of time thinking about what is government hoping to achieve through these policies. And of course, it's about jobs. It's about security. But most of all, I think it's about policy. And I use, and many other investment ministers like me, we use investment to drive economic growth into deprived areas. So you shouldn't see investment as a random walk. It's something which has to be fundamental to government policy. And to achieve that, the key thing is to actually start interacting with investors very early on. You have to design your policy mix, if you're a government minister in this field, looking for diversification, right from the beginning to unlock private capital. It doesn't work if you put a whole lot of policies together at the end and suddenly say to yourself, oh, that's good, let's mobilize some private capital to come and help us in this. So you have to involve the private sector from the beginning. And what is the best way to do that? It's having investors, real investors, sitting down with policymakers very, very early on in the policy-making process. And through that way, you lower the cost of these diversification efforts that you have to do.
Minister Abdullah, you've mentioned in your earlier response several sectors, but looking at driving economic growth and attracting investments, what are Bahrain's priorities moving forward?
I would say quality over quantity, and very much Bahrain, through the Economic Development Board, has been targeting FDI, which adds value to the economy, whether that's by creating jobs, by knowledge transfer, by R&D, and really the encouragement is always on joint ventures, tech transfers, and upskilling the Bahraini workforce. Today, we're very proud of having a workforce in Bahrain which is second to none. We have, very high quality talent, which we see is really a driver of investment from multinational companies. And so to answer your question simply, we look for the quality rather than the dollar amount. And really we see a big driver of future growth to come from the SME sector, because the SME sector makes up over 90% of businesses, and this is not only Bahrain, it's GCC wide as well. Future GCC growth we see coming from SMEs. So how do we improve the likelihood of success of SMEs in Bahrain? We look at what the major challenges are when it comes to SMEs. The first and the biggest being access to finance. And so we put together a lot of programs and initiatives to address that specifically. One of which was to launch an SME growth fund, which we announced last year in Gateway Gulf, and we will be receiving applications next week from SMEs. So, any SME interested in, a capital or more of a debt fund to drive their growth is welcome to apply. The other initiative we've done is a credit score platform in partnership with Benefit Bahrain, and this allows SMEs to be scored based on their credit viability. So it's a very sort of intelligent program which produces a score for a business based on historic performance, which will allow banks to give loans with much more transparency and much more surety that the businesses are creditworthy. And the last one, when it comes to liquidity and access to finance, is we're working on some legislations which is currently in the legislative body, which will allow assets to be mortgaged. So all assets, including receivables and tangible, non-tangible assets, which we see will be a big driver of liquidity in the economy.
Very interesting.
The other important element or target which SMEs, we would like to give SMEs assistance with, is access to markets. And we talked about the free trade agreements. Having more free trade agreements will allow SMEs to export easier and be more competitive, but also to through free trade agreements to expand into new markets, starting with the GCC and then growing to other markets.
It'll be interesting to watch that mortgaging of the assets and receivables moving forward. Ms. Henadi, from your perspective as an owner, operator, and investor across multiple sectors such as aviation, industrial real estate, and logistics. How do you view the impacts of supply chain disruptions and the volatility born out of conflict? Specifically, how should businesses approach risk management and resilience in such an environment?
So being in logistics and trade, we are no stranger to volatility. So our ethos has always been two things: digitize and diversify. On the diversification, similar to supply chains, is we diversify our assets, our investments, and we double down and focus on what we do well. For example, in the aviation sector, we own Menzies. Menzies now is one of the largest aviation services company around the world and is doubling down in the US. We just acquired a company called G2 out of the USA. So that's one thing. The other thing is in industrial real estate. We're doubling down in Saudi Arabia and other regions in order to make sure that our assets are available and diversified to hedge our bets. The second most important thing is digitization. Digitization gives us a lot of flexibility and gives our customers that level of flexibility to give an optionality. It's not just simply visibility, but McKinsey basically said that companies that digitize their entire supply chain, they're able to withstand disruption and see revenues grow 2 or 3% compared to those who don't. So that's how our modus operandi with regards to the volatility.
Lord Grimstone, finally, we've got 2 minutes, and maybe in a nutshell, this question summarizes the title of the session. Amid the rise of both free trade blocks and protectionist walls, is globalization truly fragmenting, in your opinion, or is it simply being rewritten with new centers of gravity? And where do you see the GCC sitting in that new global order?
I mean, I hate to say it, but I think that the globalization that I've grown up with almost throughout my life, sadly, is coming to an end. Remember, post the Second World War, the huge devastation caused by that, nations came together to build multilateralism, and the multilateral organizations, who did a tremendous job. But those organizations depended on the financial generosity of America and the moral generosity of America to support them. And, you know, for reasons we all know, that can no longer be relied upon. So we are going back, my belief is, to competition between nation states. And what we'll see is nation states striking agreements with each other. I mean, it's interesting, for example, you know, you're now seeing states in the Gulf striking bilateral trade agreements with other countries, as opposed to going through, you know, the multilateral agreements. It's another sign of that. So I think the world is now more unpredictable than it ever has been. And of course, that is bad for investment. Having said that, I think this region does have an advantage. I think the GCC still has a function, although my friends who were negotiating the UK free trade agreement with the GCC said there were more arguments between the GCC members than there were between the UK and the GCC in doing that, which is kind of understandable when you're trying to bring what are quite different countries together. But the world is changing. I don't think it's yet settled down into what it's going to be going forward, but let's hope it settles down to something which benefits the world, benefits the citizens, and benefits business and commerce.
Lord Grimstone, thank you very much. And members of the audience, I hope we've addressed efficiently this paradox between both the rising free trade and the rising tariffs as well. Thank you to my esteemed panelists, and thank you all in the audience.